Hello, and welcome to Norfolk Historical Society's podcast, bringing local history to life. I am Michelle Grant, President, and I know that you will enjoy listening to our members and guests talk about their favorite Norfolk County history moments. Please follow us on Twitter and Facebook, or contact us at info@norfolkhistoricalsociety.ca. Donations are welcome to help us to continue with our preservation of Norfolk County history. Enjoy.
Welcome, everyone. Most Norfolk County residents know tobacco farming is a hugely significant part of our history. So I'm here to learn about harvest cooking with Rebecca Beausaert. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Kate. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, harvest cooking. This is a new research topic for me that I'm going to be talking about, and one that is very exciting and very near and dear to my heart. I've been exploring the phenomenon of harvest cooking that took place on tobacco farms in southwestern Ontario in the middle to later years of the 20th century, focusing especially on Norfolk County. Norfolk was truly the heart of tobacco country, and much of what we know about this chore, it was a chore, of harvest cooking comes from Norfolk. And during the later part of the 20th century, tobacco really drove Norfolk's economic system. So the history of tobacco and subsequently the history of harvest dinners on tobacco farms is really rooted in Norfolk County's history.
Tobacco used to be such an integral part of our local economy, but this has changed over the years, hasn't it?
Yes. While still very much an agricultural region today, in Norfolk, tobacco growing has largely been eclipsed by horticulture. Recently, it was given the nickname of Ontario's Garden, and Norfolk is now home to some of Canada's largest crops of asparagus, pumpkins, watermelons, and lots of other yummy goods. There's simply less global demand for tobacco right now, so Norfolk farmers have had to shift to growing the crops that consumers want. But during the heyday of tobacco production in Norfolk County in the mid-20th century, signs of its prevalence were everywhere, showing just how important it was. For those of us who grew up in Norfolk, you didn't have to go far to see one of those telltale red and green kilns, many of which are still standing today and are in varying conditions, or a field of those big green tobacco leaves. And during harvest time in the late summer, the air was always ripe with the smells of curing tobacco and the very distinct aroma of the chemicals that help the plants to flourish.
So, what is your personal connection that led you to study this part of Norfolk's history?
So those red and green kills and the smell of sucker control, those chemicals, are what I consider and what I define as the sights and smells of my own childhood. I was born and raised in Norfolk County, just outside of Langton, and tobacco is in my blood. So that is what largely has drawn me to this research project. My paternal grandparents emigrated from Belgium to Ontario in the years between the First and Second World Wars. And like many other European immigrants coming to Canada at that time, especially those who were seeking a new life in southwestern Ontario, they took up farming and they chose tobacco because of the worldwide demand for tobacco products at that time. Their farm was near Walsingham, and their children, including my dad, all grew up as tobacco farm kids. When I was younger, our dinner table talk between myself, my dad, and my mom would sometimes turn to the good old days on the farm. Even when I was young, I was a bit of a budding historian, and I liked to ask questions about history. And so I'd ask about growing up on the farm. And my dad's memories always involved food, and this always stuck with me. He would tell me how on my grandparents' farm, which was in operation in that middle to later part of the 20th century that I'm looking at, my grandmother and then my aunt spent a lot of time during harvest in the kitchen preparing meals for all of the farm's workers and the family as well. And they would do this from roughly late July until about mid-September. And I, even when I was young, was impressed by the stories of these hearty meals that were served. Before work began in the day, everyone would gather around the table for something like eggs and bacon. And then after working for several hours, everyone paused to enjoy a noon dinner together, something like pork chops and mashed potatoes. And then they would have maybe a supper of cold leftovers after a really long and hot day. And as a teenager, I took my own turn working on a tobacco farm. This was in the later 1990s and early 2000s. But by that point, the harvest meal tradition that my dad had told me about was long gone. I think when I was working in tobacco, we were lucky if we got a cookie at break time. We certainly didn't get 3 large meals a day anymore. And generally at this point in time, beginning in the 1980s and then continuing on in the 1990s, that sort of hospitality was really gone. It was no longer expected of farmers' wives. By this point, the bunkhouses where workers on the farm lived had been outfitted with kitchens, and more farmers' wives were working off the farm or working elsewhere on the farm, doing some of the lighter field work or kill work or strip room work, as was my experience.
Rebecca, can you clarify for our listeners who may not know what goes on in the strip room?
Of course, I know it sounds a little bit odd. The strip room is where the cured tobacco was graded and sorted. I remember it being a very dirty job because all of that dried dirt on the cured tobacco leaves would be in the air when you were sorting. At the end of the day, you would usually leave the strip room covered in dirt.
Thank you. So, this tradition of harvest dinners was strongly tied to the role of women?
Yes, from the research I have done so far, it is only women who perform this role. And that's another facet of this project that really interests me. My own experiences working in tobacco, hearing my dad's stories of growing up on the farm, along with my academic background in gender and rural history, has prompted me to consider more closely women's roles on tobacco farms generally, and especially how prevalent and important this obligation was of farmers' wives having to provide meals for their workers. And what I have learned is that indeed it was a very important yet often under-recognized and underappreciated aspect of tobacco growing. So my investigation and my research looks at the development of this tradition, the place of women on farms, and what was going on in these women's kitchens. And not only do we see why women's culinary efforts were indispensable, but also what was considered good, hearty food at the time. And then finally, what the recipes and the ingredients and the cooking methods can tell us about these women, about their families, about their skills, about life on a tobacco farm, and what workers wanted to eat.
Wow. Food may seem like such a monotonous daily need, but it's such a huge part of cultural identity, survival, community, and health. And women have traditionally been given this important responsibility. Would you say their role has been underrated?
Absolutely. Historically, on tobacco farms, the higher profile and more labor intensive jobs were men's domain. The farmer, who was typically male, not always, but typically male on tobacco farms, supervised the farm, supervised the workers, and then dealt with the sale of tobacco at the end of the season. Male laborers employed on the farm did the heavy lifting jobs, so to speak, the jobs like priming tobacco, hanging tobacco in the kiln, driving the boat or the tractor, things like that. By the 1950s and 1960s, we see some women doing some other harvest work around the farm, things like what was called working at the table or being part of the table gang, or working in the strip room, like I just talked about. These were considered the less labor intensive jobs, even though they weren't. But the tobacco industry typically attributed a farm's success to the ingenuity of the male farmer. A good crop, a good yield, a good harvest, good prices at the end of the season. That was all due to the farmer's work and the farmer's knowledge. The work that was supplied by women on the farm, whether it was in the kitchen or elsewhere, was usually considered complementary.
How has this history been recorded?
Much of what we know about the lives and experiences of female workers and tobacco farmers' wives comes from oral histories. So, women telling their stories to researchers or journalists or passing down their memories through their families. Another really important source is a magazine called the Canadian Tobacco Grower. This was, in essence, the tobacco farmer's Bible. And probably a lot of people in Norfolk still have dusty copies of it sitting in their basement today. The Canadian Tobacco Grower had a pretty wide readership between the 1950s and 1980s, and its content was aimed at growers in southwestern Ontario and Norfolk County especially. Male readers were the target audience, and you see this in the articles about equipment and growing techniques and things like that. But what I find super fascinating is that most monthly issues also contained a column devoted to women and their duty to produce meals for the harvest gang. And from these columns, we gain really wonderful insight into the importance of farmers' wives' cooking and the harvest meal tradition. From what I can tell, the first of these columns appeared in 1953, and then the last was in 1988, kind of signifying the years when the harvest dinner tradition was at its peak. The column was overseen by the magazine's food editor and staff writer, a woman named Shirley Glendinning, who was from Delhi. She was actually a teacher who dabbled in journalism and interestingly admitted that she was not really well versed in culinary matters when she took on the task of writing the column. So what she did was she would contact and then interview local tobacco farmers' wives in their homes, mostly from Norfolk and from around the county. She would visit them and taste some of their favored recipes. And then she would publish a short bio of each woman, along with their recipes and tips for getting through several weeks of harvest meal preparation. And before she retired, Glendinning had conducted over 300 of these interviews. And at one point, she referred to the women that she interviewed as my ladies. So she had quite a bit of sort of affection for them. And she mentioned at the end of her time with the Canadian Tobacco Grower magazine that by taking on this job, she herself learned a lot about cooking, and she felt it was a privilege to be invited into so many of these homes that she visited. And looking back, she had a really envious position, being able to taste all these recipes that she wrote about. And she mentions that two of them, nuts and bolts and vanilla pudding squares, became some of her favorite foods. She took a lot of the recipes and in 1982 compiled them into a cookbook called Pick of the Crop, Volume 1. And then a second edition, Pick of the Crop Volume 2, was released a year later. And I know for a fact that a lot of women and households in Norfolk still have these books.
Wow, thank you, Shirley, for your important work that helped preserve these stories and recipes so we can continue to enjoy them. So, when did the tradition of harvest cooking begin, and how many people were being fed this way?
The practice of harvest cooking began in earnest in the 1940s when tobacco growing really started to take off and then flourished as tobacco farmers increased their acreages. Between the 1950s and 1970s, the harvest gangs on tobacco farms were usually comprised of local help and temporary workers who came in from Quebec, the United States, and occasionally Western Europe. It was widely known at the time that jobs in tobacco were plentiful, so usually workers could easily be found. The problem, though, was that they often underestimated just how tough the work would be. So occasionally, Norfolk farmers did struggle to find a good, reliable labor force. And the number of workers on a farm varied. In some cases, women were cooking for 10 to 12 people 3 times a day. In other cases, it was upwards of 20 to 25 or more. In June of 1962, Shirley Glendinning mentioned in the Canadian Tobacco Grower that she had interviewed a farmer's wife named Mrs. Amanda Spobkowski, and she was often cooking for upwards of 36 people during harvest time.
That is not a small task.
No, not at all. And Shirley Glendinning acknowledged this in her column. In October of 1963, she noted that there should be some kind of a medal to award harvest cooks or some kind of a hall of fame. She mentioned that women at the time didn't think anything of what she called this mammoth cooking chore, but she thought and believed others would agree with her that it was a very demanding job, especially when women handled the task by themselves. And that last point was the case for many women, as they usually did do the job on their own. It was not something typically that women came together to do as neighbors or as family members, because often the women in your life were cooking for their own harvest gangs. So this was something that was usually a pretty solitary task.
So, how did this mammoth task fall on the tobacco farmers' wives?
So there were a few reasons. On many tobacco farms, the workers were itinerant, meaning they lived at the farm for harvest and they didn't have permanent homes nearby. Often they were younger bachelors with no cooking skills. Before the 1980s, as I mentioned, the bunkhouses that workers lived in did not have full kitchens with the capacity to cook full meals. So many farmers' wives worried about their workers' ability to feed and care for themselves. Also important, providing ready-made meals was about efficiency. Meals ready to go at set times saved workers the hassle of cooking and cleaning up. Harvest days were busy, and farmers did not want their workers stopping long for meals. So having a meal ready to go that all workers ate together was really a time-saving practice. And lastly, many oral histories confirm that workers actually gravitated towards the farms that were known to serve good, hearty food. Filling and tasty meals kept workers happy, and happy workers were thought to work better and harder and be on time more regularly. So in that way, women's culinary labor actually played a really key role in the farm's success by ensuring that the labor force was working at their maximum capacity and they were happy and they were willing to stick through harvest time.
So, women were expected to cook competitive quality meals on top of such large quantities. Do you have any insight into the pressure they were under between harvest meals and being wives and mothers as well?
Women faced a lot of pressure to keep their harvest gangs happy and to keep their households running at the same time. With the workers, often they tried to serve food that the workers were accustomed to. On one farm, for example, workers who had come up from the southern United States were fed southern staples like grits and rice. On another farm, the Italian migrant workers were served spaghetti. Some farmers' wives noted in their interviews with Shirley Glendinning that even though they kind of went above and beyond to appease their harvest gangs and their tastes, some of them had no problem making requests or shunning certain meals that the women were serving. In July of 1977, Mrs. Louis Sabota from La Salette, in her interview with Shirley Glendinning, mentioned that she was disappointed that the French Canadian workers on their farm just wanted what she called plain meat and potatoes, when she wanted to whip up some of her delicious Hungarian specialties laced with sour cream and paprika. Many cooks, to slightly relieve the cooking burden, often served a cold supper, either leftovers from the noon meal or cold dishes like deli meats and salads. But to some workers, this was considered subpar as a meal. They wanted hot meals only. So this meant more time, more work, more energy for women. So here we can see some evidence that women's efforts were not always appreciated by those outside of the kitchen, and that workers misunderstood what was involved in this task. And it's important to think about what a typical harvest day would look like for a woman. Typical harvest day was long and hot and humid and busy. Everyone on the farm would usually be up early, but women typically woke up even earlier to get the household in order and to begin the day's food preparation. And it's also important to remember that some farmers' wives were younger and also looking after small children at this time, which adds to their workload. And on top of cooking, all women had other daily tasks in the home that still needed their attention. So no spare moment in the day was wasted. You were on the go constantly. The time between meals, you would do your dishes, you would plan the next meal. Nighttime, you would often spend those hours baking or canning or tending to your gardens. And even the work of preparing these meals happened beyond harvest time. Women actually started preparing in the spring. They would make and freeze desserts. They would start canning some early spring produce, and they would butcher or purchase extra meat to help expedite meal preparation during harvest time. And then in the winter, when there were no workers to cook for, they would use this time to try out new recipes on their families. So there really wasn't a lot of downtime when it came to this chore. You were always sort of thinking about it or preparing for it, even though harvest wasn't happening all the time. And the home also had to be adapted to serve these harvest meals. Most houses on tobacco farms were not exceptionally large, so basements or summer kitchens or sunrooms usually were the rooms that had to be outfitted with the long tables, capable of holding anywhere from 12 to 25 people at mealtime. On our family farm, my aunt had to have a table specially made to accommodate the harvest gang, one that was big enough for everyone to sit around.
I think even now there's a lot of unseen labor that women do every day, even without so many mouths to feed. Clearly, there was more to preparing harvest meals than just the cooking. What were some examples of unseen labor related to making these meals?
So feeding a harvest gang involved several other supplemental tasks beyond cooking. So things like menu planning, shopping, budgeting, setting the table, laundering linens, and washing dishes. And each harvest cook had her own method and schedule. Some cooked off the cuff with whatever was in the house, while others planned out several weeks of meals and rotated menus. It took a lot of thought and creativity to come up with several weeks worth of meals. So regardless of how it was accomplished, it was a huge chore. When Mrs. Jean Beniff of Delhi was cooking for a harvest gang of 24 in the early 1960s, she told Shirley Glendinning that the dishes from the noon meal usually took until almost 2:30 in the afternoon to finish. So probably as soon as they were done, she would have jumped to start preparing for dinner. And amidst all of this, women are sometimes juggling childcare, as I mentioned, housekeeping, laundry, sometimes also doing laundry for the workers on the farm, assisting with odd jobs around the farm, and occasionally women did the bookkeeping for the farm. And many of these women also volunteered in their communities and did public service. So they enjoyed being part of groups like the Catholic Women's League or the Women's Institute, or some of those other civic improvement societies that were popular in the middle to later years of the 20th century. So that also had to be factored into the workday. And when Shirley Glendinning interviewed Mrs. Louis Docker of Cortland in 1973, Mrs. Docker told Shirley that, yes, she did enjoy cooking, but she'd especially enjoy it if that's all that she had to do during harvest. So kind of calling attention to the fact that cooking was one of her jobs, of course, but there were so many other things she had to do on top of that. And no one ever admitted it in print, or at least not in the Canadian Tobacco Grower magazine. But when harvest ended, these women must have been bone tired and thrilled to be relieved of these extra duties.
These women were tough. Did they realize how amazing they were?
If they did, they probably never said it out loud. In the interviews that were published in the Canadian Tobacco Grower, the women almost always displayed very modest opinions of themselves and their tasks. Most did not express any sort of worry or stress because they didn't want to seem ill-equipped or inexperienced. They simply did the work, and over time, it became routine and mundane. In 1977, Helen Nemeth, who was from Langton, told Shirley Glendinning that she actually felt most comfortable cooking for the larger gangs of workers. In her mind, if you're going to go through all of the prep and all of the work for a small group of people, you might as well just add some extra bodies to the table. And some women did express this sort of veiled pride in their work. They felt pride in how many people they could feed every day. And they often noted that it was an enjoyable experience because they truly did love cooking, despite the pressures and challenges of harvest time. So I think they were proud of their roles, but generally women downplayed the value of their cooking. And some even expressed worry that they seemed lazy for using appliances like dishwashers or accepting help from their mothers. And along with doing this task on their own, so-called good harvest cooks were also expected to be very frugal. And this is also apparent in the interviews that Glendinning conducted. Many of the women grew as much of their own food as possible, and they wanted to be self-sufficient, though we do see this really dropping off in the 1970s as more and more packaged foods are becoming available and food trends are changing. Several women mentioned that they kept cows and pigs and chickens and butchered them for harvest time. They also nurtured large gardens which had lots of vegetables in them, and in some cases they had small fruit orchards for baking and canning. And as much as they could, women incorporated seasonal produce into their menus to save money, and any excess would have been canned or frozen to be consumed once peak season was over. And other foods on the harvest table were often homegrown as well, along with butchering their own meat and growing their own vegetables. Many cooks baked and used their own bread and their own buns. But again, we do see that sort of work falling off and becoming less common as time went on.
So recipes and what was considered typical harvest meals changed over time?
Very much. The recipes are wonderful artifacts of the different time periods in which they were served, and they can really tell us a lot about those years. Harvest meals were almost entirely homemade, with the occasional packaged food incorporated. In 1953, for example, when Mrs. Paul Fleece was interviewed by Shirley Glendinning about her efforts to feed her harvest gang, she told Shirley that she still churned her own butter. This is 1953. And she approached cooking with what she called a wholesome and economical point of view by growing and raising most of her own food. And the food at the Fleece farm was bountiful. A typical harvest breakfast could include coffee and dishes like poached eggs on toast, pancakes, hot biscuit, French toast, and bacon and eggs. By the 1960s and 1970s, harvest cooks are becoming more comfortable using some of the newer and popular packaged foods that are coming out in their cooking. These packaged foods were also becoming more available on rural and small town grocery store shelves, so that was helping as well. Especially you see foods like Jell-O, Campbell's condensed soup, and margarine in so many harvest recipes from the 60s and 70s. Margarine especially seemed to hold a special place in these cooks' hearts, as it was almost always used in place of butter in their recipes, especially in baking of all things. And this was likely a combination of trendiness. Margarine was very trendy at the time, and margarine also had a good shelf life, so it was economical. And at that point in time too, some people argued that margarine was healthier than butter. So that's probably why we see it in so many of those recipes. The food that was served was very carb heavy and very calorie dense, likely to keep workers full throughout the day. A typical breakfast could have eggs, bacon, pancakes, toast, or oatmeal. At the noon dinner, it wasn't uncommon for a soup to be served first, followed by some sort of meat and potato main, different kinds of roasts or chops, mashed or fried potatoes. Or instead of a meat and potato main, there was the ever trendy casserole, which was gaining popularity in the 1960s and 1970s as an economical food saver. Supper time, the meals varied from hot dishes to leftovers to deli meats and salads, as I mentioned. Drinks included coffee, tea, milk, fruit juices, lemonade, and then eventually powdered drink mixes like Freshie and Kool-Aid, which could serve a lot of people. Desserts really stand out. Desserts were plentiful and always had a place on the harvest table. Fruit and cream pies, varieties of cookies, donuts, fruit loaves, cakes of all shapes and sizes, bars and squares, jello salads, all of them usually prepared from scratch, but in some cases with help from packaged ingredients like jellos and puddings and other mix-ins.
I'm sure those dessert recipes boosted morale on the farms. Who said breakfast was the most important meal of the day? So, how did the expense of harvest meal cooking change over time? I'm sure that had an impact on what was served as well.
The cost of making these meals was discussed quite a bit in Shirley Glendinnings's interviews, especially in the 1970s when North America was going through an economic recession. In the tips that were offered to Shirley Glendinning and readers of the Canadian Tobacco Grower, women recommended using cheaper cuts of meat like ground beef and saving more expensive options like chicken for a treat on Sundays. The casserole, again, was important here as it became a vessel for any leftovers that were found in the fridge because no food ever went to waste. And casseroles were also great because they allowed you to carb load. Many of the casseroles on the harvest table often had pasta and rice or pasta and potatoes. So they were cheap and they were filling. Another way that menus reflected broader trends in Canadian food culture and economics. In the 1970s, we start to see North Americans' fondness for fast food becoming more obvious and finding its way onto the harvest table. Things like homemade pizza, hamburgers, and French fries were being served to harvest gangs. It's important to note, though, that they would have been homemade. Rarely would women order takeout from local restaurants to feed the harvest gang. This would have been incredibly expensive. Plus, in a way, it was kind of like cheating, because again, women never wanted to seem like they were incapable. So they were expected to be making meals from scratch. So they used their skills instead of ordering out to make homemade versions of fast food and restaurant favorites. And in doing so, saved quite a bit of money.
Now, you had mentioned women would try to appeal to workers' stomachs by being mindful of the traditional foods in their respective home countries. What did that look like?
So, along with what we consider to be Canadian or North American cuisine, we also see the culinary traditions of tobacco farmers' homelands being incorporated into the harvest menus. Many of the tobacco growers in southwestern Ontario were first or second generation immigrants from Western and Central Europe. Many came to Canada after the end of the Second World War, fleeing war-torn Europe in the hopes of starting fresh. And they continued to cook the beloved foods of their homelands. And naturally, these recipes also appeared on the harvest table as The farmer's family often ate alongside the workers. So, in many homes, as Shirley Glendinning's column shows us, together with those casseroles and meat and potato mains and lasagnas and jello salads, we also see a lot of Hungarian, Polish, German, and Belgian recipes being served. Dishes like pierogies and goulash, soups, different kinds of waffles, cakes, and torts, all of them using old world techniques and ingredients being offered to workers. So it became kind of a really unique and interesting culinary hybrid of old and new world traditions on the harvest table.
The technology of farming clearly evolved over time. How about the evolution of cooking technology?
The evolving world of kitchen technologies and cooking technologies was also a popular topic among farmers' wives. In their interviews with Shirley Glendinning, they often reflected on the changes that had taken place in their lifetimes because many of these women did the harvest cooking for several decades, so they saw a lot. In the 1940s and 1950s, for example, harvest cooks tended to use electric hot plates and wood stoves and frozen locker services to cook and store food. Frozen lockers were a rental storage space in a public facility. It's kind of the frozen version of a storage unit. You would use it before you had a freezer in your home. And then by the 1960s, many homes had wonderful new labor-saving devices like dishwashers and electric stoves, which many women mentioned made their jobs a lot easier. The large chest freezer, which became widely available in the 1960s, seemed to hold a really important place in women's hearts as they were considered indispensable during harvest time because the chest freezer could hold all of those pre-made foods and meals that kept harvest meal preparation running like a well-oiled machine.
So, what else have you noticed while researching this in terms of gender roles and interconnected parts of farm life?
I found that the Canadian Tobacco Growers Food column illuminates a lot about the gendered nature of tobacco farms. Basically, that on tobacco farms in this period, there were spaces and jobs that were designated appropriate for men and women based on popular ideas at the time about men's and women's abilities and their place in society more generally. Shirley Glendinning's food column specifically reinforces the continuing importance of women's so-called innate ability to be good cooks. The task was always left to them because allegedly women are just born with the ability to cook. But the columns also show the value that women placed on being part of a collective in which their experiences and their recipes and their knowledge could be shared and reproduced. It was kind of like an exclusive club that only some members were part of, and they could share their trials and tribulations with one another. The food columns also reveal how much tobacco farms in the later part of the 20th century were sites of both continuity and change. When tobacco farmers began introducing more machinery, which reduced the number of workers that were needed and mouths to feed, women's place and the value of their work on the farm also changed. By the 1980s and 1990s, as I saw in my own experience working on a tobacco farm, women may not have been needed in the kitchen anymore, but they were still an important source of labor on the farm, albeit still in gender-specific ways.
Due to health concerns like the link to lung cancer, etc., the tobacco industry has receded. But what legacy did the tobacco farm heydays leave behind?
The number of tobacco farms still operating today has certainly dwindled, but I think the legacy of harvest dinners lives on, even though the harvest dinners themselves don't. Many of the women in Norfolk County who came of age on these farms, or the ones who were taking on that massive harvest cooking chore, still make a lot of those same recipes, or they pull out the pick of the crop cookbook when they need a tried and true dessert. And their memories and their experiences and their words and their voices need to be saved and archived, because there is so much that we still need to learn about the roles of women on tobacco farms, culinary or otherwise. And this is true for Canadian women in agriculture generally in the 20th century. So my hope going forward is to be able to conduct my own interviews, like what Shirley Glendinning did, with the women who are still with us and whose memories of the harvest meal traditions are still intact. Historically, the work that women did on farms of all shapes and sizes was indispensable. Farms could not have operated without women's blood, sweat, and tears. And this fact is obvious to me when we look at women's efforts on tobacco farms in Norfolk to keep workers fed and happy, because it was an important role that certainly contributed to a farm's economic success. It's part of Norfolk's history, and it's that tobacco farming legacy, and it deserves much more recognition than it has received.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for giving us this great lesson on such a niche part of Norfolk's history. And I'd also like to give a huge shout out to Shirley Glendinning for the work that she did to preserve this history so you're able to research it. Now, for anyone who's really interested in learning more about this, what would you recommend that they search for in terms of resources?
So anyone can feel free to reach out to me. My email address is rbeausae@uoguelph.ca, or on Twitter, I am at Rebecca Bow 14. If you want to find some of these recipes, you can look at original copies of the Canadian Tobacco Grower magazine. There are copies available at the Delhi Tobacco Museum and also the University of Guelph Library. I believe the two pick of the crop cookbooks can be purchased at various places, though I'm not sure if they're still being printed. I would suggest contacting the Delhi Tobacco Museum for more information, or looking in local bookstores around the county. I wanted to add that I'm also looking for research subjects for this project. So if anyone listening would like to be interviewed, anyone who grew up on a tobacco farm or worked on a tobacco farm and experienced the harvest meal tradition, I would love to speak with you and encourage you to get in touch.